And welcome to the men's soccer video for the Black and Gold Bannerets Fall Olympic Sports Recap Series. With me to go over the 2022 men's soccer season is Austin David, who spent the season in the booth covering the team with ESPN Plus. Austin, how you doing?
Man, it's been a I'm doing good. It's been a crazy couple months of soccer that culminated in that World Cup final the other day. But yeah, it's actually nice to kind of have a break and kind of look back at everything now that it's all over.
Yes, it was quite the World Cup. I'll tell you that. It certainly put a good exclamation point on this soccer season. But if you're a UCF men's soccer fan, it's certainly a nice little respite from a season that maybe didn't really live up to the potential it had given its last season in the American Athletic Conference. And that's kind of where I want to start. Where do you think this season, like when you put the do the autopsy on this season, where do you think the issues lie? Was it in the American Conference itself and how different it was, or was it more with the team? Was it with injuries? Just kind of where do you, or is there some combination of all three?
It's definitely a combination of all three, but I think that not having Gino Vivi for a good portion of the season when they were so reliant on him in terms of their creation on the offensive end, that hurt them a lot. The fact that that was offensive end, defensive end. I think they at the end of the season when they played USF, they were on their fifth and sixth center backs. That's never good. I can't remember a time, and I talked to Scott Calabrese after the season. He said I can't remember a time that I've had to go that deep in my bench at the end of the season when I've had, you know, all my center backs be either out, injured, suspended, etc. So it was a very difficult end to the season by the time it came to it, where they were basically relying on having to win against USF, who was a very quality program who made it pretty far in the tournament at the end of the day. But it was a very tough ask, to kind of throw guys who didn't necessarily play together very often in the defense to try and stop a very potent South Florida team. And yeah, that was just one of the many things that kind of happened throughout this season, um, that kind of derailed their chances at doing anything.
You yeah, you mentioned that USF because it's so funny to me looking back at this schedule because I have it up on my other monitor. I mean, you have wins against FIU and at FIU and number 13 Charlotte. You lose to number 14 Tulsa on the road by one, and yet you have a loss to SMU that you probably could have won. You have a loss to FAU at home, and then a loss to UAB. I mean, do you think that stuff like this is it? Does this speak to how deep the AAC was this season, or do you think that that these were just games that the team just kind of tripped up in?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think, yeah, the conference was much better. The quality had improved. The teams weren't necessarily as familiar with each other, at least with UAB and Charlotte, some of the newer teams, but like FAU and FIU, those are teams that UCF had played before. Um, I think one thing that kind of was different from last year is they played much more road games than they did home games, simply because they had to fit the schedule in. Um, and I remember talking to Scott about this. He was saying something along the lines of like the way we had to schedule teams was not conducive for the amount of home games that we wanted. So they only played 6 home games and they played 7 away games. It's usually the other way around, where they play more home than away. So I think that contributed to it a little bit. The fact that they traveled the entire, cross country to play UC Irvine, they won there. It was looking good at the beginning of the season. They had the quality performance against Wake Forest, who was at the time 15th in the nation. They only lost by one, and they didn't have Gino for the majority of that game. Then they won 3 straight. It was looking pretty good. They won against Temple 4-0. It was smooth sailing. They hit a little bump in the road against Memphis, and then the FAU game. and then the SMU game. And when you lose three straight, something happens within the mentality of the team. You start doubting yourselves, and it really didn't recover from there. Yeah, they had some good performances in between, but there were just too many moments within this team that just kind of fell apart. And I think the biggest example of the moments aspect is that SMU game where they were up 1-0 heading into the last 15-20 minutes of the game, and then they concede two goals back to back in the span of 3 minutes, and they lose. And it's just a switch turned off. They stopped playing for a minute. They took their foot off the gas, and all of a sudden they go from 1-0 up to 2-1 down. And that is the epitome of this UCF season, where they're just moments where this team was great, and then the moment they switched off, they lost themselves the game. And I think that the coaching staff would probably agree with that, where they were preventable. This was just an inexperienced team, guys that hadn't necessarily played together often, um, along with all the other injuries I mentioned earlier, and that kind of culminated into the way the season played out. But don't take credit away from the rest of the American, because you had, I think, 4 teams ranked at one point within the season. I think Memphis was ranked, SMU was ranked, Charlotte was ranked, and Tulsa was ranked. I mean, that's impressive.
Oh yes, it really was. I remember when we were in the Banner Rec group chat, we were kind of marveling at the fact that Charlotte could potentially have missed the conference tournament while being ranked,
Mm-hmm.
which is insane. And I want to bring up the conference tournament. How much stock do you put on missing the conference tournament? Because this is the first time since 2009 that the UCF men's soccer team has missed a berth in the conference tournament. How much stock do you kind of put in that, or do you just kind of credit it to just how deep the American is, and some people just have to be on the outside looking in?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely both, but I think that there is a lot more to think about when you say, oh, you missed the conference tournament for the first time since 2009. That is notable. The first time in the American Conference and the last time in the American Conference. That definitely does play a factor into kind of what you're looking into for next season, because it's essentially going to be a retooling, not just in a new conference, but also with a new roster, because you're losing potentially a number of big pieces within this team. You have all the graduating seniors that stayed around for their extra COVID years or whatnot. But you also have players that could go in the MLS SuperDraft, which I know we'll get into in a little bit, but there it's going to be very difficult for Scott Calabrese and his crew, because they have a lot of players within this roster that are young and up and coming and have a lot of good upside. The issue throughout this course of the season was that they still were learning. And when they were relied upon, they weren't up to snuff at the time to play against that competition. The hope is that you get a couple years under them, they become good. And you can see with a lot of the young players, the freshmen, the sophomores, they have very good upside. There's a lot of talent there. You can see those flashes of brilliance, but that's going to come with time. So I think that, kind of going back to my first point with the conference tournament, there's definitely a lot to put into not making it, because if you make the conference tournament, you give yourself a shot at the very least to make the NCAA tournament. Whether you go in a deep run or you lose in the first round, it's still making a tournament. Just having your season end at home to your rival, that stings a little bit more as well. And I know the players felt that, especially the seniors, to go out the way they did. That hurts.
Yeah, you mentioned the seniors. I remember talking to Mauricio Villalobos several times this season, and he's talked about those moments where, sometimes the game can just change like that. I mean, he came back for one more season, and unfortunately, it didn't really go right from. How important was it for this team to have Mauricio Villalobos as a leader? Because you mentioned how these players don't really play together as often, but they did have that kind of rock in the leadership category with Mauricio for a long time.
Oh yeah, I mean, Mauricio was massive. not just on the field but off the field in terms of trying to keep this group together. The the way he's been just a catalyst of this entire program, basically since when did he start? 2018, I think, is when his freshman year was. I mean, he was big, he was coming off the bench for them in their freshman year, and then he's another one of those guys where, like, when I talk about the young players up and coming, becoming better, Mauricio is a prime example of that. Like, he was appearing in games his freshman year, and then his sophomore year progressed. Junior year was even more integral, and then senior year as well. I mean, like, he was the team captain. The way that he progressed is the way that other young players should look at and say, this is the kind of trajectory I want to go into, because at the end of his career, he was one of the most vital parts of the UCF midfield. Not because of his goal scoring, not because necessarily of his assists, which he did have many, but because of the way he controlled the tempo of the game. Because he was getting into the offensive third, he was getting into dangerous areas, he was getting back and helping defensively, he was distributing from the defensive third. I mean, he was a do-it-all kind of guy, and as much as they're going to miss Gino Vivi next year, I think they're going to miss Mauricio more because of what he gave to them in that midfield. And yeah, everyone looks at the defense for stopping goals, and they look at the offense for scoring goals. But what the midfield three in Scott Calabrese's system does is so much more integral to both sides of the ball, that I think that Mauricio is going to be probably the biggest loss for this team heading into next season.
You mentioned Gino Vivi. He had the Mauricio actually shot the ball a lot more than I remember him doing. He managed he managed to he shot the ball 20 times this season. Half of them ended up being on goal. With Gino, he also had 10 shots on goal this season, but you mentioned him earlier. He was injured for a good part of the year. He, alongside Luca Dorado and Gino Vivi, went to the MLS draft showcase recently, and of course Vivi this season also managed to etch himself into the annals of UCF history by getting his 61st point, which gets him into the top 10 all time in that category. First time that anyone's gotten up there since Cal Jennings did. And then he's also notched his 23rd assist, which puts him in a tie for fifth all time in career assists. No one has made that much since the turn of the millennium. No one's gotten more than 21 assists in a career since the turn of the millennium. So just to kind of put into perspective how, I guess, generational of a player for UCF men's soccer, at least from an assist standpoint, that Gino Vivi is. You mentioned that not having him was a major impact on this team. You just kind of go into, because I believe he said before the season that this was his last year, so it seems like he's going. So
Mm-hmm.
how big of a loss is Gino Vivi for this team? I know you said Mauricio was a little more, but Gino on top of that?
Yeah, I mean, the offense was stagnating when Gino wasn't on the field, and they were thriving when he was on the field. I mean, it was a night and day difference when he played and didn't play. Um, he only played in 10 games, started in 7, was coming off the bench because he was hurt, and then ended up not sticking around for the full game because he was, not able to go the entire way. That made UCF suffer, and you could see how integral he was just to the creativity of the offense. And no knock to, like, Kevin Andrews, but he's no Gino Vivi yet. And the way that Gino not only is confident on the ball, he's silky smooth with his movement. He is just he's very decisive. Like, when he's what he wants to do, and that speaks to his I guess amount of playing time. He's become confident with the ball, and you can see that confidence radiate not through him but through the entire team. And when he is on the ball, he's going to do something special with it. You're not worried about like, oh, what's he going to do with it? You kind of understand, and that the players around him understand, like, okay, when he makes this move, I need to go here. When he, pulls back, I need to move out of his way so he can get the shot away or something. Um, that kind of player only comes around every so often, and to have a player that scored a lot of goals but also assisted a lot of goals. I think he finished with like 19 goals and 23 assists. Um, that's impressive, man. I to be able to do it on both ends, to be able to score and assist, do everything in that final third. Not only that, but he was drawing defenders. When he was on the field, teams would focus more on him to allow space for other players to thrive, and that again is the mark of a very good player. Not having him on the field is going to be very tough for UCF. They're going to have to again retool for next year. There's a lot of pieces that they're going to have to replace, and Scott and his coaching staff, they have a lot of work to do in the offseason to try and find new players, whether it's in the transfer portal, whether it's in recruiting, uh, or whether it's within their own team right now. Um, they have to figure things out, and I feel like this season was almost a wake up call for that. To be able to kind of look inward and look outward and say, okay, we've been able to thrive with the team that we've had for so many years. What are we going to do now?
Well, one other aspect of that we talked about how Luca Dorado went with Gino Vivi to that MLS showcase, and Luca Dorado, like you mentioned, that Gino Vivi scored a lot of goals, but this season wasn't really, it was definitely a smaller portion of that goal scoring pie. Luca Dorado, if I'm looking right, there's like one goal that's listed to team, so I don't know what individual scored it. If you discount that goal, Luca Dorado has the exact same number of goals as the rest of the team combined.
Mm-hmm.
He in 3 seasons, Luca's made it. He scored now 28 goals, which puts him in a tie for 8th all time in career goals in UCF history. I mean, and this is only in 3 seasons. He still has years of eligibility to use, but of course, you have the MLS draft. I mean, do you think what do you think as far as the future of Luca? Do you think if he goes to the, obviously, with the MLS, you lose a major goal scorer, but even if he returns, whether he doesn't get drafted or if he does get drafted and elects to come back, what do you think is going to be the key with Luca going forward with if Gino Vivi is gone? Because the connection that they have is clearly, worked.
Mm, that's tough. I think with Luca, he has come into his own in terms of just a talent in the front. I remember talking to his coaches over at Montverde, and they're like, "Yeah, he's a winger. Like he's been playing on the wing in high school." And then Scott Calabrese saw him and said, "He's going to be our number 9. He's going to be our striker. He's going to be the guy up top." And the progression that I saw from his freshman year all the way till this year has been immense. I mean, he has far and away become the goal scoring product that Scott wanted to see in him when they first moved him up front. And it's been really impressive to see his skill set improve, his confidence on the ball improve, his scoring touch improve. He's become a danger anytime he gets the ball in the final third. He's also coming into the midfield and providing for all the wingers. Like he is a prototypical number 9 now when he started out as a winger, which again, credit to Scott Calabrese and Paul Souders and the entire coaching staff. They've done a great job with Luca, and again, credit to Luca himself. He's done the work, he's put it in, and become the player that now is a potential MLS draft pick. When I look at his draft prospects, though, yes, he scored a lot of goals, and he still got eligibility left, and he went to that MLS draft showcase. The biggest thing with MLS is their international player rules, and all 3 players that went from UCF to this MLS showcase, they're all international. So it was Gino, Luca, and Anderson Rosa. And I'll get into Anderson in a second because I think he is definitely a sleeper in terms of the draft. I feel like he he could be drafted higher than Luca or Gino. Maybe a bit of a hot take, but let me finish with Luca first. The biggest thing with him is, yes, he's Brazilian. Typically speaking, you have to be a generational talent to be picked up by an MLS team in the first round if you are an international, because teams have to use an international roster spot on international players unless they have a green card. And usually college players, they have to be it takes them a couple of years before they can get their green card, and then they can be, a domestic player considered. I think with Luca, he's definitely shown that he has the talent. I think that he has shown that he has a very good skill set for MLS. He's only 5'9", but he plays much bigger. He's quick on the ball. He's got a great scoring touch. Those are very good qualities that teams like. Problem is, as a forward, most teams are looking outside of the US. They're looking international. They're spending millions of dollars on players who can score, because ultimately at the end of the day, those are the guys that will win you and lose you games. If you score goals, you win games. If you don't score goals, you lose games. It's as simple as that. So teams will go outward and find the big name talents that have already proven themselves in other leagues to buy, to bring in. That's why you see a guy like Cal Jennings, who has proven at every level that he can score goals, and yet is still in USL Championship, even though he's a domestic player.
Yeah,
And again, he's a guy that when you looked at him in college, you're like, man, this guy's going to be the next big thing, and he's still in USL. So I think with Luca, his draft prospects are high. I just don't know what team will take a flyer on him and what team will try and commit to him.
So, it's funny you mentioned that these domestic players that have definitely proved themselves, but they're playing in the USL. It's funny because former UCF player Aji Berry this
Mm-hmm.
year
Mm-hmm.
was recently transferred from the USL to Future FC in Egypt, and it was described as the largest transfer fee in USL Championship history. I mean, Aji Bear, the fact that someone spent that much on him, and yet it was Egypt, and he was still not make it into the MLS, is kind of speaks to the talent level there.
I don't know if it's necessarily the talent level. I think it comes down to the level of MLS comparatively. Like Egypt. When you think of Egypt, you don't think of soccer. Um, and Haji was great. I thought that at any point he could have gotten a call up from an MLS team because he was killing it in MLS or in USL. He was scoring for fun. He had the skill set. I mean, when he was drafted by Orlando City, there was potential there. It just didn't hit until years later. But there's so many of those guys in USL that are like, wow, this guy could be the next thing in MLS, and they never quite get there. And I don't discredit Haji for taking the payday and going to Egypt, because it's hard to make money as a USL player. The disparity between USL and MLS in terms of payment is bigger than people think, and there are times where USL guys will have to get a second job in order to make ends meet. I remember talking to guys years ago who played in USL. One of the guys from Orlando City, when they won the championship in 2011, the next day, one of their star forwards was working in a restaurant, and family came up to him and said, "Oh, we saw you in your game yesterday. By the way, can we get a refill?" And that's the kind of moment where it's like, wow, it's minor league player. Like, it's a minor league system. So like USL is minor league. And again, with these guys, if they don't make it to MLS and they go to USL, that's minor league. So it's going to take a lot to get from that point to a Major League Soccer team. But again, with Luca, with Gino, and with Anderson, I think those guys have the talent to do so. It's just sometimes it really comes down to luck and the situation that they end up being in.
So what do you think then is the prospects on them being selected and then coming back? Because I remember Giannis Learman, who got selected in the MLS draft, ended up transferring to Pitt instead, and
Mm.
and so it's this and so even if you're drafted, it seems like you could still come back to college if you wish to.
Yeah,
So
as long as I think they don't sign a professional contract with said team that they're drafted by, I think they still have eligibility left. So I'm not 100% sure at the rules in terms of that. Um, but yeah, I know at the very least with Luca and Anderson, they have eligibility left over. They're both juniors, plus COVID years, so I think they have 2 years left of eligibility. And then Gino technically has a year of eligibility left. Um, at least that's what Scott told me a couple months ago.
COVID year, I think.
Yeah. The question is like, I mean, he's been there so long. I don't know if he sticks around. Maybe he tries playing overseas. Maybe he tries playing in USL. Um, it's really up in the air for a lot of these guys in terms of what they end up doing next. Because again, there's so many players out in the college realm that are very, very, very good. Um, and it didn't help that UCF didn't have a good season. I think that hurt a lot of these guys' prospects more so than you probably think. Even though they had good numbers, teams take into account, is this, yeah, you're putting up numbers, but are you winning? So I
Well,
think that's going to hurt a little bit in terms of their prospects this year.
you mentioned Anderson and that you mentioned he may be a bigger loss than the others. And one thing I've noticed with him is that he's been one of the only rock solid members of the back line, for years now. I mean, I'm looking, there are only four players that have played over 1,000 minutes on the pitch this season, and they are Mauricio Villalobos, Juan V. Munoz, who's the goalkeeper. I'll talk about him in a sec. AJ Seals in the midfield, and then Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
No backline player was on there as long as Anderson has been this entire season. Is that kind of presence, missing that kind of presence, for the reason that you think that could be a bigger loss if
Yeah,
he
well, I mean, it's not just the back line. I mean, because AJ ended up moving from the midfield to right back, so he ended up playing the opposite side of Anderson at the end of the season. But let me put it to you this way: Anderson, since he joined as a true freshman out of Montverde, he has started every single game for UCF. He has been the rock solid piece for the Knights this season, last season, the COVID season. He's been not only good defensively, but he has been a threat offensively. He loves overlapping. He loves cutting inside. He plays like a winger, but has the innate defensive mindset of a defender. He's got a great left foot. He can do free kicks. He is just an overall solid player. And I think his skill set maybe is slept on simply because he didn't put up numbers. Like he's got a goal a season, and I think a handful of assists in his career. But when you watch him play, he's fantastic. He's a great player, and a lot of teams will look at that and say this is a kind of player that we could use as a fullback, as a wingback, as a left winger even. And I think for depth at the very least, there are teams that would love a player like Anderson Rosa on their team. Again, the biggest thing that they're kind of looking at is like, oh well, he's Brazilian international. Can we spend an international roster spot on this kid? I think that because of the way MLS looks at players and says, okay, the attackers are where we're spending our money. Where can we find midfielders and defenders for our depth for our team. And that's where a player like Anderson Rosa will come in and say, you know, he's a perfect depth guy. He can play a multitude of positions on that left side, and I think that teams will look at that and say, this is a guy we want. This is a guy we can draft second, third round. Whereas Luka, they could say, oh well, we've got like 5 forwards already. Where is this guy going to fit in? Um, but yeah, I'm interested to see how things turn out on Wednesday if they do get drafted, if they do sign, or if they do come back.
So to put things in perspective, by the way, on these success, UCF did not make the conference tournament.
Hmm.
When you look at all AAC first teamers, we have players from 4 players from Tulsa, 2 from SMU, 2 from FIU, 1 from Charlotte, and 2 from UCF, which were Luca Dorado and Anderson Rosa. A team that did not make the conference tournament had more first teamers than one that did. And in case you're curious, Gino Vivi made second team all conference as a midfielder. And you mentioned, with his skill set, can really put him in either one. And he's listed as a 4 on the roster, but he's a midfielder to the conference. But I mean, the fact that you have these 3 players on the pitch together and to not see and to not make the conference tournament, I mean, I don't know if you would consider this a lost season in a way, but I mean, not making the conference tournament with them there is certainly not exactly the way you want to go out of the American.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a lost season. It was a great for individuals, not for the team. And that's the kind of way I look at it, where like you had great individual performances, but again, in terms of their professional prospects, teams will look at, well, how did the team do? Um, it, it's tough because again, a lot of the games that they had this year, they didn't necessarily deserve to lose. They were 1-goal games. They were, moments that they slipped up on, and it just kind of culminated multiple times over. But sometimes that's the way the sport goes, and you have to kind of ride with those results and live with those situations. And yeah, it's tough. But when you look at the draft prospects for these guys, I all 3 of them could be drafted, and none of them could be drafted. That's kind of the way I'm looking at it right now.
Well, the only other night that got an honor from the conference this season was goalkeeper Juan V. Munoz, freshman that made it onto the all rookie team. So Juan V, of course, true freshman coming out of, I'm bringing it up now, out of Spain. I mean, Calabrese just sort of threw him into the fire on this, and he ended up making the all rookie team. You think that says something? What do you think? What do you think about him as far as his career progression this season?
He learned as he went. I could definitely see the progression as he played. There were moments where he saved UCF and moments where he kind of let him down. And those are kind of what you expect from a true freshman goalkeeper. But he was unique in that he had professional experience heading into UCF. Played with I think Getafe, the B team in Spain, and had some experience before coming to UCF at a higher level. So despite him being a true freshman, the expectation was very high for him to come in immediately and perform. There was a reason that he supplanted Tyler Levine, who, for all intents and purposes, would have been the starter coming into this year. He proved it last year with his shot-stopping ability. The difference between him and Wanvi was that Munoz had better feet. And for the way UCF likes to have their goalkeepers, they like them to be basically another center back who can kind of initiate offense from the goalkeeper position. Whether it's long balls, whether it's cutting balls through the defense, they want a goalkeeper that has both, and Wanvi does. What I think that he was lacking a little bit in was some of his decisiveness when it came to balls into the box. There were times where he'd kind of sit back and wait for balls, and other times he'd be overly aggressive, more so the aggressive part than the passive part. And sometimes it's just learning the timing, learning when to come out, when to make punches, communicating with your defense, which again goes back to the fact that they had so many different defensive combinations that it was hard to kind of have consistency in front of him. But I think that when you look at how his season played out, it was overall good, but still lacking. There was still more that could have been done, still more that you kind of expected from a guy who came in with professional experience prior to being a true freshman in college.
So unlike the rest of UCF athletics, one of UCF men's soccer will not be moving on to the Big 12 because the Big 12 doesn't sponsor men's soccer,
Mm.
and they're going to be going on to the Sun Belt instead.
Mm-hmm.
And they will be joining another Big 12 team in West Virginia. But from what I'm seeing, the big cheese in the Sun Belt is Kentucky, who again, the SEC doesn't have men's soccer either, so you have a few SEC schools that are in the Sun Belt as well. You have them who were a number one seed in the NCAA men's soccer tournament this year, only got upset in the tournament by Pittsburgh, and then they also have Marshall, who managed to earn who managed an at-large bid, finished 11-4. I think they were ranked number 12 going in, and
Yeah.
then for some reason, and then Georgia State actually didn't do half bad this year either, finished 12-4-3, even though they weren't ranked. So you have those. So you basically have Kentucky, Marshall, West Virginia, South Carolina, and is the other SEC school there, Georgia State. I mean, you have the potential of losing three major contributors to the MLS and then a couple more to eligibility, to the loss of eligibility. So what do you think Scott Calabrese is going to need to do with the Summit? Do you take more of a long game approach because you have have a goalkeeper that looks like you can really develop for a little bit? So do you kind of I guess go into a little bit of a rebuild mode and slowly build, or do you think that especially if Luca and perhaps if Luca and Anderson come back, do you think they'll be able to retool and maybe be healthier next season, and that could have a potentiality of allowing them to compete in the Sun Belt? And do you think competition in the Sun Belt, because obviously you have two teams that were NCAA tournament worthy already with Kentucky and Marshall, do you think Sun Belt could even support another bid if UCF were to do good?
Who? There's a lot in there. Hold on. Okay, so first off,
Probably a little lot there. Sorry
no,
about
no, no. I'm just kind of gonna run through it chronologically. So first off, in terms of rebuild, I think I touched on this earlier, but basically with UCF, they need to look inward. They need to look outward. Scott and his staff need to decide where they want to move forward. I think it's going to be a bit of a rebuild, um, depending on how things go in the draft. If all three players are gone, that's a massive change in the complexity of the team, because not only are you losing Gino, Mauricio, Luca, that's your entire offense. You're also losing Lucas Morrow, who was also a starter for a lot of period of time due to eligibility. So basically, that's your entire front three. That's your entire goal scoring. It's not easy to be able to just supplant new goal scorers. That's the hardest part of soccer. Um, the defense at times looked good. Zane Bubb has a year of eligibility left after tearing his ACL. Rafael Crivello, I think he'll be back as well. Those are your two starting center backs heading into the season potentially, and they're solid. I think having played together now for a little bit, they'll be better. But if you're losing your left back, you didn't really have a right back to come into the season. AJ Seals was playing there because they couldn't figure out who was going to be their right back throughout the season. You're losing your starting midfielder, your captain. That's 5, 6 starters out of your 11. Sounds much like a rebuild comparatively to just a retooling. In terms of the conference competition, there are very good teams heading into this Sun Belt team or this conference. Marshall won it, the whole thing, the NCAA tournament 2 years ago. They're very good. Kentucky is very good. I mean, you look at up and down this entire conference, it is just as or more competitive now than the American was. I think there were a lot of teams in the American that kind of went under the radar in terms of their talent, whereas this Sun Belt conference will have names because of the schools that they're attached to, like Kentucky. Um, I think that there's going to be a very healthy competition. UCF has to do some good recruiting in order to keep up with that. It's tough to say, but I don't know as it stands now. I don't see them being competitive that first year. I think it's going to take at least another year or two for them to kind of hit their stride in the conference because of how many players they're going to be losing, how many key pieces they could be losing. But all this is speculative because we don't know what's going to happen on Wednesday when the MLS draft happens at like 5 o'clock, I think is when it starts. Because the entire team can change in an instant depending on who gets drafted or who depends if they decided to stay or not. So it's all speculative at this point, but as it stands right now, a lot of work needs to be done for the coaching staff and for the recruiting standpoint of things to try and replace the pieces that they've lost heading into this team. And in terms of the at-large bids, I mean that conference is good enough to have a number of them. Whether they are given a second one in terms of automatic bids, because it's so new and so many different teams have come into it, I think it'll take a couple of years before that happens.
So as far as so basically, because now we're just so to be clear, if we are recording this on December 19th, the MLS draft is on December 21st. So basically, if we maybe one or multiple of these players come back, then it's more of that's a build to year two in the Sun Belt. If none of them come back, then it's more of a longer term, because Coach Calabrese, I mean, credit to Terry Mohajir for having faith in Calabrese, because he extended Calabrese's contract more than any other UCF coach to the 2027 season. Now, this was before the Sun Belt, was in the picture at that point. But I mean, what do you think about as far as if they do have to rebuild? Do you think that now that Calabrese kind of has that job security till then, that he's able to really work with this team and kind of make a rebuild happen should it be needed?
Yeah, I think that the long-term contract does help. I feel like Scott's not one of those guys that likes to sit on his laurels and say, right, I've got 7 years to figure this out. No, he's going to be day one, probably he's already started trying to figure out what the next step is for this program. He's probably talked to the players. He probably knows what they're going to be doing if they get drafted, if they don't get drafted. He's probably tried to convince players to come back for another year of eligibility. With no guarantees of them playing or not. And I think that he's got a plan in place. Of course, we don't know it yet, but you never know what can happen. He's going to try his best to try and put a winning product on the pitch from day one of the Sun Belt, but injuries play a factor. Players transferring play a factor. You've seen it with UCF football, where a lot of guys who committed are decommitting now and transferring out and moving on, despite moving on to a bigger conference. I don't know what will happen with UCF soccer, but it's definitely going to be interesting. It's definitely going to be interesting.
Oh yes, I mean already, because this is the first time I think in in that I can remember of use of a UCF sport not being in the university's primary conference. And if I'm remembering right, this may be the first time since football was in the MAC that was the case. I don't know if do you remember do you remember off the top of your head when the last time was?
No, I have honestly no clue.
Got it. Well, basically the point I'm trying to get at is while every other school is gonna be focusing on the Big 12, Coach Calabrese is kind of on his own little like tropical island in the Sun Belt, dealing with a bunch of different teams. I'm certain though that what do you think about that being in that conference with West Virginia, like that the only other Big 12 team there? I mean, I think I remember talking mentioning somewhere that they should just hype that up as the Big 12 conference championship game every year or something.
Yeah, I mean that's probably a fair thing to do at this point. No, I think having at least one other Big 12 team is good. Um, I think that the hope is other Big 12 teams sponsor soccer at some point. Um, I feel like because of the World Cup just happening, the World Cup happening in 2026, it'd be beneficial for schools to kind of jump on that soccer train. I know I'm a little bit biased because of my soccer background, just smidge bit, but uh, soccer is a very very growing sport right now. I think that it would behoove schools to kind of buy more into soccer than they have in the past. Things have changed a lot since men's soccer became more of a uh, stable sport to kind of have as a school. Um, I just hope that other conferences kind of see that as well and start sponsoring more. Where so this doesn't have to happen. I know it happens on the women's side as well, where other schools don't sponsor women's soccer, or they sponsor women's soccer but not men's soccer. It's I feel like it's easier just to do both, but that's of course my biased opinion. So um, yeah, just hoping that the World Cup kind of sheds light more on the popularity of soccer in the U.S. now, especially now after this one, but also heading into the 2026.
So, yep. So, thank you so much for your coverage of the program. By the way, all of it's been extremely insightful. And as we look forward to the Sun Belt for this, and not the Big 12, it'll be interesting to see what Coach Calabrese will do with this program. Can you tell the guys, what are you up to nowadays? Soccer season's over, so what's next for you before you get to do it all again next fall?
Oh, it's all basketball season, man. It's you know, got stuff going on with Rollins College basketball. I'm over there doing stuff with them pretty much every home game that they're on, and yeah, just kind of waiting and seeing what happens with the rest of soccer, and um, have some things in the works. Can't really say too much just yet, but yeah, very exciting stuff happening.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your input on this. Not exactly the season that we would have initially wanted for them to exit out of the American with men's soccer, but some individual players or look to have some great success, and we can all be proud of that. And if we end up getting them back, then perhaps the team can see some success as well sooner rather than later. So thank you so much for your time, Austin. I really appreciate it, and good luck with Rollins and whatever else you have in the future.
Appreciate it.